Okay, so assalamu alaikum, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from different parts of the world. I'm Dr. Sohaila Chima, the Assistant Dean for the Institute for Population Health and also an Associate Professor of Clinical Population Health Sciences here at Weill Cornell Medicine in Qatar. So just want to extend a very, very warm welcome to all of our participants joining us from different parts of the world, and Ramadan Kareem, Ramadan Mubarak to all of you. It's a blessed month of fasting for Muslims, and we hope you all have a wonderful Ramadan. So let's get started. You're joining us today for the Health and You Community Wellness Series. And again, the overall goal of the series is really to create community awareness about health and disease. And the ultimate objective of the series is really to enhance self-care, reduce suffering, improve the quality of life, and increase healthy longevity. Just a reminder that this is not a CME or CPD activity, and it's for the general public. So your cameras and microphones have been turned off. You can use the Q&A tab, the feature, to type your questions or comments. You can also post them in the chat for us, and we will be able to see your comments or questions. Questions will be addressed at the end of the session. I will moderate the Q&A, and no certificates of attendance will be issued since this is not a CME CPD activity. So this is our topic for today, plastics and human health. Very, very timely, very, very interesting topic. And we have a wonderful speaker joining us today. So it gives me great honor, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Amit Abraham. He is an assistant professor of clinical population health sciences and also a population health research specialist working at the Institute for Population Health at Weill Cornell Medicine, Qatar. He helps in managing the public health research and community programs, particularly those that promote health awareness and disease prevention in the state of Qatar. He's an active participant in IPH's public health teaching programs for pre-medical and medical students, and his primary research interests pertain to environmental health and its impact on the local community. These comprise, but are not limited to, air quality, particulate matter, respiratory disease, pesticide use, climate change, and sustainable urban and community development, with a focus on the interplay between these issues. His other interests include lifestyle medicine, risk communication, and public health. Dr. Abraham is an alumnus of Weill Cornell Medicine, Qatar, having obtained his MD in 2011. He has also completed his master's in public health from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health from Baltimore, USA. Dr. Abraham, a very, very warm welcome to you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sohaila, for the kind introduction. Thank you to everyone for being here. It's a pleasure for me. Today, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about plastics and their impacts on human health. So as I'm sure everybody is aware, plastics are ubiquitous, right? They can be found in things from our kids' toys to our cutlery to probably the device that you're watching this on. And it's really almost impossible to imagine life without plastic today. And this is because of the many advantages that they provide. They are incredibly versatile, they're incredibly flexible, they're durable, they're relatively inexpensive and lightweight, and they're also able to be molded into practically any shape. So these qualities that make plastics so useful are precisely the same ones that are a source of some of the issues that we're running into plastic today. So we're going to spend some time today talking about this. So I've got nothing to disclose. So we will start off by talking about some of the fundamentals. What are plastics? And we'll realize that trying to define plastics is actually a little bit trickier than one might imagine. What are the different types of plastics? What are its components? Why is it that plastics are considered to be a problem? And what is it that we as individuals can do about this? So plastics are actually a complex mixture. The main component is what's called a monomer, which is basically a combination of carbon and hydrogen atoms, as you can see in the image here. And many monomers then are joined together to form long repeating chains that are called polymers. So in the image, what is shown is a monomer of carbon and hydrogen atoms. Specifically, it's called ethylene. And many ethylene monomers are joined together to form a polymer, which is called polythene. And polythene is what we use in plastic bags, for example. So you can think of monomers as the links in a chain, and the polymer itself is going to be the chain. So the difference in the chemical structure of these monomers and polymers is what gives different kinds of plastics. So there are about 45 different families of plastics. So if you think of things like PVC, polyvinyl chloride, polystyrene, etc., those are the different families. And then within the families, there are many different variations. Now, in order to make the plastics, in order to synthesize these long repeating chains, we use certain compounds that can facilitate or enhance this process. And these are referred to as catalysts. Usually the catalysts are completely used up by the time the plastic is finished. But sometimes there can be some trace amounts or that are left over. And so we've actually been able to detect trace amounts in these consumer products once they're out there in the market. And lastly, there are certain additives that are put into the plastic to give it certain physical properties or qualities that we want. So for example, certain additives can confer heat and UV resistance, ultraviolet resistance. So the plastic can withstand being in the sun for prolonged periods of time. Other kinds of plastics like softeners can be added to make the plastic more malleable or flexible. Sometimes we add pigments to provide certain colors. Plastics can also be made water repellent or flame resistant by adding some of these chemical additives. So, and on and on and on. There are thousands, literally thousands of these additives in use today. And the important thing to realize about these additives is that they are not chemically bound to the polymer chains. And so under certain conditions, they have a propensity to leach out. So they may migrate from the plastic into the surrounding. Now, this leaching out is more likely to occur with higher temperatures or if the plastic is placed in direct sunlight. So under those specific conditions, you are more likely to see these additives leaching out. And that is an important thing to keep in mind because I will come back to that later. Now, some of the catalysts that I mentioned, as well as the additives, may have heavy metals in trace amounts. And so when I say heavy metals, I mean things like lead and cadmium, but these are also present in some plastic items that we may see around the house. Plastics usually, the vast majority, are synthesized from fossil fuels, but they can also be derived from more renewable sources such as vegetable oils. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. So there was a magazine in the US called the Life magazine. It was very popular in the 1950s and 1960s. And in 1951, they dedicated a cover of the magazine because they were describing the versatility of plastics. And they basically heralded a new era of throwaway living. The idea being, since you no longer have to do your own dishes, you can just throw them away. We can cut down on our household chores, and therefore we're making life more convenient. So that's a snapshot into the thinking of that period, and that thinking has sort of continued on today. But the problem is that plastics, while they are incredibly useful, the amounts that we are producing is starting to become a problem. So let's start talking about common plastics. We see a lot of plastics if you were to look around your house, and plastics are actually tremendously beneficial to our society. So for example, for food safety and hygiene, they're critically important because they keep our food fresh while we're transporting them across great distances. They increase shelf life and they minimize food waste. They're also critically important to the healthcare sector because a lot of devices we use in the healthcare setting are comprised of plastics. And of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we wound up using a lot of disposable face masks, gloves, face shields, and the like. All of that is made of plastics. If you think about what we use every day, things like disposable cutlery or takeaway containers, those are all made of plastic. Our kids' toys, you know, the annoying Lego blocks that we're always stepping on, those are made of plastic. About 1/10 of all automobiles today are also made of plastic. Plastic is an insulator, so it is used in adapters, cables, and the like. A lot of technology today uses plastic, not just in the obvious places like the casings, but also in the circuit board itself, there's plastic buried in there. The piping that we use to bring drinking water into our homes, as well as take away sewage, is also made of plastic. What is perhaps less obvious is clothes and shoes. Any synthetic fiber is considered to be a type of plastic. So from nylon to rayon and polyester, these are all kinds of plastics. Polyester, in fact, is considered to be a type of PET, which is the same kind of plastic that is used to make disposable water bottles. It's just that the additives in there are slightly different and the way the plastic is prepared is different, so you get completely different properties. Other less obvious sources of plastic, if you think of tea bags, mostly they're made of paper or muslin, but they also have a little bit of plastic to make them longer lasting and so that they don't lose their shape. Cigarette butts, so the kinds that are used for the filters in cigarettes, are made of plastic. And cigarette butts are actually the most littered plastic item today, more so than polythene bags. Cosmetics are another source of plastic. They're full of plastics, and that might not be the first thing that comes to mind. So the exfoliants or scrubs that you see in things like face washes, they're full of plastic microbeads. They're tiny, tiny little beads of plastic. Toothpaste also has these microbeads because they have this abrasive quality, so it helps to keep our teeth clean. Whenever you swipe a credit card and you get your receipt, that receipt is made of paper, but that paper is coated or lined with plastic. So plastic is literally everywhere. It's ubiquitous. So I'm going to throw some numbers at you right now. This graph is taken from our world in data, and basically it illustrates the disconcerting rates of the production of plastic. And plastic production really skyrocketed in the 1950s, immediately after the Second World War. And it has essentially doubled in every decade since then. So this amounts in total to about 9 billion tons of plastic, which is an absurd number. It's something we would have difficulty wrapping our minds around, yeah? About half of these 9 billion tons of plastic were produced in the last 15 years. So clearly the rates at which we are producing this plastic are going up. 2/3 of those 9 billion tons of plastic that have ever been produced are still around in some form of the other. Some of it is still in use today, but the rest of it has been discarded in terms of debris in our oceans, in our soil, in the air that we breathe. And it turns out even in our own bodies. Now, single-use plastics account for about 45% of the annual production. And just to give you a little bit of context, the average person uses disposable plastics for about 15 minutes before discarding it. So think about that. Half of what we produce every year gets thrown away after 15 minutes of use. So that's just an insane amount of plastic being produced and thrown away. So I have a poll question for you now. Raji, if you can set that up for us, please. So the question basically is, how concerned are you about the impacts of plastic on your own health? Okay, so I think we have quite a few responses. Most of us seem to be in the somewhat concerned to extremely concerned groups. So let's start to address some of these concerns. Thank you, Raji, for that. So how are plastics considered to be a problem? So the first thing that has really gained a lot of attention recently is microplastics. Microplastics are basically any plastic that is less than 5 millimeters in diameter. So if you think of a pencil, if you look at its cross section, I don't know if you can see me, it might be kind of small, but the cross section of the pencil is about 5 millimeters in diameter. So that's not very large at all. And these microplastics are classified into two groups, primary and secondary. So primary microplastics are basically the plastics that have been intentionally designed to be this small. So think of those microbeads that I talked about earlier that are used in cosmetics or in toothpaste. Those are considered to be microplastics. The other kind of microplastic, the secondary microplastics, are basically breakdown products. So we have larger pieces of plastic that have undergone weathering. So maybe the action of the sun or water that breaks it down into smaller and smaller particles until eventually it's called, classified as a microplastic. Now, the secondary microplastic actually are the majority of the microplastics that we see out in the environment today. And microplastics really are concerned because of this process of biomagnification. So the idea is that if you think of creatures that are out there in the oceans, let's say plankton, for example, they tend to consume plastic because they mistake these microplastics as food. And this microplastic tends to accumulate up the food chain because smaller fish eat these, they consume these plankton. And then because they consume so many of this plankton, they're also ingesting more of the plastic. And when larger fish consume that, the process repeats all the way up into humans. So now when we start talking about the health implications, I do want to start off by explaining that it's a very complex problem and we're only just beginning to understand this. It's a very, very new issue. So we are limited in terms of how diverse plastics are. Remember, I said there are 45 broad categories of plastics. And we're also limited because there are so many different additives that are being used. And I want to point out that the way that plastics are synthesized is proprietary, which means that when manufacturers make a kind of plastic, their exact recipe for making the plastic is protected. So we don't have the information in terms of what exactly is going into that recipe. And so in order to understand its true health implications, we're kind of limited by that. And we're also limited because when we do understand how some additives, their health impacts are, but we don't understand what happens when we mix in all those additives together. But we do realize in terms of the scale of the problem, exposure is widespread because we have done tests that have shown that plastics are everywhere in the environment, but they're also in human tissues, as you can see on this list. And I just want to draw your attention to the placenta, because basically what that means is that we're exposing babies and very young children to plastics as well. Now, when we talk about health implications, we have to consider the plastic itself. So what I mean by that is the monomers and the polymeric chains. And we have to consider those separately from the health implications of the chemical additives. So when we take the polymeric chains, our data on this is very, very new and very, very weak. So this is an area where we don't fully understand what is going on. From what we have, we suspect that the microplastics themselves, the polymeric chains themselves, may cause some harm to the digestive and cardiovascular systems in a very localized fashion. We do not understand if this is something that translates into long-term health implications. And we do not understand if this is a very localized thing. So for example, if it's affecting our stomachs, does it just stay in the stomach or does it spread through the system? This is something we don't yet know. And so until we do understand this, these should remain a source of concern, especially because it seems to be everywhere. The route of exposure predominantly seems to be through consumption or ingestion, although we do have some data that suggests that we are also breathing in these microplastics. When it comes to chemical additives, most of the known dangers of plastics actually come from these additives. And remember, these additives are not chemically bound, and so they can leach into the surroundings. So listed here are some of the additives, and some of these are possibly you have heard of, so things like bisphenol A or BPA. That's received a lot of attention recently. Now, a lot of these additives on the list are considered to be endocrine disruptors. What this means is that they interfere with the production and the metabolism of sex hormones, things like testosterone and estrogen. And so we know that these exposure to these additives can impact human fertility. Now, there is some evidence that suggests that these additives can cause harm to developing brains. And so this could possibly result in learning disabilities or reduced cognition. And there is some evidence that suggests that there is an association between exposure to these chemical additives and the development of cancer as well as heart disease in the long term. Now, I know this might seem quite scary, but the good news is that a lot of these additives are now starting to be regulated in certain jurisdictions. So for example, a lot of products are now BPA-free and phthalate-free. Now, I mentioned earlier that early life exposure is very important. And that's because babies and infants are exquisitely sensitive to hazardous chemicals. And plastic associated exposures are actually linked to higher rates of pregnancy complications, such as premature delivery and low birth weights. Early life exposures to plastics may also lead to an increased risk of non-communicable disease later in life. So for example, if you have an infant who's exposed to these kinds of additives in the womb, once they're born and they grow up and they become adults, they may have a higher risk of developing diabetes and heart disease. And what's more, they may actually pass on that higher risk to their own children as well. So there's this propensity for it to be passed down across multiple generations. Now, when we think about, if you ask the question, why is it that plastics are a problem? The first thing that comes to mind is disposal, right? About half of all the plastics that we produce today goes to the landfill. Now, in high-income countries which have proper waste management systems, most of this plastic is well controlled in these landfill settings. But even so, there is the potential for it to leach out and contaminate the surroundings. And we have some research data that suggests this. And in countries which lack proper waste management systems, where littering is far more common, obviously this is much worse. About 20% of all plastics winds up being incinerated, which is not the most friendly way to manage plastic waste, because burning plastics actually converts it from one form of a waste to another. And in fact, it produces very toxic chemicals that we know can actually cause cancer, things like dioxins and furans. The rest of the plastic that we produce that is disposed of actually winds up in our waterways and eventually the oceans. And I'm certain everyone here has seen plenty of pictures of marine creatures and birds ingesting or choking on plastic. When it comes to recycling, I'll come back to that in a little bit. But so far, what we've done, what we've discussed is the health implications of plastic during the use of the plastic and the disposal of plastic. But we should also keep in mind the other stages in the life cycle of plastics and their potential for causing harm. When we talk about production, what we mean is not just the extraction of the fossil fuels at the source, because remember, fossil fuels are the source of most of our plastics today, but also the manufacture and refining of these plastics. And so the production, so if we take fossil fuels to begin with, its manufacturing and extraction results in a lot of pollution, both in terms of air pollution as well as the surrounding environment, including water and soil. And chronic exposure to pollutants like this has been linked to many heart and lung diseases as well as death. Furthermore, the production of these fossil fuels has been linked to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. About 5% of all greenhouse gas emission actually originates from plastic production. Refining and manufacturing of plastic involves the use of very hazardous chemicals which need to be carefully handled. Things such as benzene and formaldehyde are very commonly used in the synthesis of plastics. And you may have heard about a couple of months ago, a train had derailed in the US in the state of Ohio and was actually carrying a lot of industrial chemicals, most of which was vinyl chloride. So that's a gas that's used in the synthesis of PVC, but there were other products such as benzene in there. And even now, 2 months down the road, they're still involved in the process of cleaning that up. And people who live in the vicinity are actually complaining of a lot of different health symptoms. So obviously, safe transportation is also a key factor to consider when we talk about plastic production. We also need to keep in mind that the majority of plastic production today occurs in low-income countries. So this is also an issue of social justice as well. So I have another question for you, Raji, if you can set that up first, please. What proportion of plastics do you imagine gets recycled every year? So we seem to be fairly evenly split for the moment. Most of us seems to think it's somewhere between 25 to 75%. Okay, so we can end that poll, please. Thank you, Raji. So the correct answer, as it turns out, is 9%. Less than a tenth of all the plastic we produce today winds up getting recycled. So it's a common misconception that plastics can actually be recycled many times over. As it turns out, things like glass and aluminum are highly recyclable. Upwards of 90% of those items can be recycled, whereas plastics cannot. And the reason for that is the way that plastic recycling currently runs today. So what happens is you have to sort the plastic, first of all. So remember that there's so many different kinds of plastic. You need to separate those plastics out because you cannot recycle different types of plastic. You have to separate them. So you sort them first, you then have to clean them, and then you have to melt them down and remold them. So every time you recycle process in this way, its quality gets degraded because it loses its tensile strength and its viscosity. And so, for example, if you start off with like a plastic water bottle, after it gets recycled, its quality is you're no longer able to get a water bottle out of it. Instead, you might be able to get a few synthetic fibers which you could stitch into to create a carpet. And so plastic can only be recycled a very limited number of times before it basically becomes unusable and therefore has to be discarded. Also, you have to keep in mind that recycled plastic is usually not suitable for use in food packaging or the medical setting due to the risk of contamination. So this is, if you look at most plastics, you will see a little number on it. And I just wanted to explain to you what the number means. So you have numbers from 1 through 7. And the numbers basically tell you what is the primary polymer in that plastic item. And so usually 1 and 2 are considered to be highly recyclable. So if you are trying to sort out your plastic waste, 1 and 2 is what can go into the recycling bins. The others not so much, either because of the quality of the plastic or because very often plastics are actually mixed together. So you could have many different families of plastic being blended together. And so therefore it's impossible for them to manually separate them and then recycle them. Or if it is possible, it's just not financially feasible to do so. Sometimes the additive itself is going to be the issue rather than the plastic. So for instance, plastics that have been color black cannot be recycled, and it's because of the colorant rather than the plastic itself. Now, I just want to highlight that plastics with the numbers 3, 6, and 7 are not always BPA free. So if you're looking for plastics to avoid, 3, 6, and 7 are the ones you need to avoid. And I know a lot of people are concerned in terms of the amount of plastic waste they're putting out, and so they tend to, or they try to reuse some kinds of plastic. Usually it is fairly safe for us to reuse 2, 4, and 5, but I would not recommend reusing anything other than 2, 4, and 5. And the 2 is usually the kind of plastic that you would see in the plastic milk jugs that you find. 4 is usually the kind of plastic you see in a plastic bag, a polythene bag. And 5 is usually the kind of plastic that you'd find in furniture or these big durable items. I also wanted to mention briefly about bioplastics because those are frequently touted as a solution to the plastic problem. So bioplastics are essentially the same thing as conventional plastics. The only difference is their source. So their source is considered renewable because you take them from things like corn or potato or sugar, and you create like a vegetable oil out of it, and then you use that oil to create or synthesize the plastics. Now, this does not mean that these plastics are inherently biodegradable. They are not. In fact, you basically synthesize the same polymeric chains that you do with conventional plastic, and you add in the same chemical additives as we do with conventional plastics. So what you are doing is you are taking away the harms from the production and refining stages of the life cycle of plastic, but you are not taking away the harms from the use and disposal stages of the life cycle. And bioplastics actually come in with its own set of problems. So currently, most bioplastics today that you might see are actually a use of a mix of fossil fuels and bioplastics. So we aren't making enough of bioplastics to actually create them on a large scale. So the renewable sources are not the sole source. And also because the source of bioplastics are crops, staple crops that we use, this creates additional pressure on the agricultural land and water supplies, and therefore it can actually impact food security today. So going forward, here are some of the questions we need to consider, we need to tackle, some of which we actually know how to tackle and others we're still trying to figure out as a society. So the most important and probably the most effective action we can take is to reduce the production and use of plastics. But this is obviously not something we can switch to doing immediately. And also, there are certain sectors of our economy that we absolutely cannot phase plastic out currently. So as I mentioned before, food packaging and medicines. But given this, is there a way that we can minimize the harms that are associated with the use of plastic while still currently using them? And then is it possible for us to make the plastic production more circular? We do have some legal frameworks in place in some countries and in some states that regulate the use of plastics. Do we need to strengthen these frameworks? And if we do, how do we go about enforcing these rules and regulations? And we also need to keep in mind that some countries that have contributed the least to this problem tend to suffer disproportionately. So how can we address these questions in a fairer and more equitable manner? So I want to highlight what actions have been taken on an international scale. And so this is really a story of incremental progress. And so there have been a series of meetings and conventions under the umbrella of the UN Environmental Programme and the UN Environment Assembly, the UNEA. And so basically it started off as recognizing ocean plastic pollution as a concern. And they were trying to quantify its impacts and coming up with solutions to mitigate it. And gradually this switched to recognizing that plastics don't just impact the environment, but they impact us as humans as well. And so I want to draw your attention to the last row here, the UNEA resolution in 2022. And so this is regarded as something of a milestone because they aim to have a legally binding treaty by the end of next year to try and manage plastic problem. They also aim to try and adopt what is called the precautionary principle. And for things that are very highly regulated, so things like medicines and vaccines, manufacturers are required to prove that not only do their products work, but that they're safe for human consumption. So they have to show that they are not toxic. And so for in the US, that is the regulatory body is the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. Here in Qatar, it is the Pharmacy and Drug Control, which falls under the Ministry of Public Health. And so there are very strict regulations in place to make sure that vaccines and medications are safe for human consumption. However, plastics and other things in consumer products are not required to be shown as safe, which is kind of why we are in the situation we currently are in. So this resolution hopes to change that and hopes to try and ensure that plastic production or plastic products are actually adopt the precautionary principle. And so we have made some progress in terms of local areas. So for example, a lot of products now are BPA free. And so that illustrates how industry and companies can make substitutions if needed, at least within certain sectors, right? And what we need to do now is try and make sure this happens in a proactive manner rather than a reactive manner. And we need to have better regulations in place. So what have we been doing in this country? So the World Cup that we had in last December actually received a lot of praise because of its efforts for trying to go carbon neutral and for trying to minimize all waste production, including plastics. So wherever possible, plastic alternatives were preferred. And if not, plastics were recycled. And plastic use was also offset. So basically, they went out and tried to remove plastic waste that were out there in the oceans. And Education City has sort of been used as a testing bed for new policies for the country. So for example, we got recycling bins here a few years ago before they became quite common throughout Doha. And also now, if you look at food and beverage outlets, so things like cafeterias and food courts, they no longer offer disposable or single-use plastics. Instead, they offer reusable takeaway containers and reusable lunch boxes. And so they also provide incentives for people to start using them. In construction sites within Education City, they no longer use plastic, or if they do, they are actually recycled. And so they report that this has resulted in about a 20% decline in plastic use. And one of the universities within Education City, Hamad bin Khalifa University, HBKU, has actually launched an app called QCons. And what this app aims to do is to educate users in terms of what the different types of plastic products are, how we can go about sorting plastics for recycling, which ones are compostable or not. It also alerts you in terms of which is the nearest recycling point. You can earn tokens which can be redeemed with their local partners if you can prove that you're actually recycling. So there are a lot of these ground up as well as top down steps that are being taken that I just wanted to highlight. So I have a question for you, and if you can put these answers in the chat, what is it that you as individuals try to do to try and minimize your plastic consumption? And if you can just type this in the chat. or if at all there is anything that you do to try and minimize your plastic consumption.
Okay,
Segregation.
Segregation, yes, we are getting some answers in. Participants, please just post in the chat, what are you trying to do at your level? So it would be at an individual level to minimize your plastic consumption. Okay, so we have used glass boxes, proper segregation of waste, use eco bags as suggested when going to markets or groceries, use reusable paper items. By bringing your own basket, if you go to the supermarket, to minimize plastic, use cloth bags, use paper bags, reusing the bags, using paper bags.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Those are all wonderful suggestions. And basically, the idea that we're trying to promulgate here is we want to sort of hark back to the wisdom of previous generations, that pre-throwaway culture. If you remember the magazine that I mentioned earlier in this presentation. And so we want to try and make things more circular, right? And so I have a few things over the next couple of slides. I do want to emphasize the fact that you don't have to do every single thing on this list, on these slides, because it may not be possible for you to do so. And that's completely fine. We all do what it is that we can do, and then try and go on from there. So it's a small step that can make a difference. It is also advisable not to try and adopt all these actions at once, because if you try and make very large changes over a short time frame, you might wind up, these changes won't wind up being sustainable, and it's not something that can become habit. So rather, I would suggest that you pick one item or one action from this list and try it over a period of time. And if you find it works for you, that it becomes second nature, then you can pick another action on this list and build from there. So a lot of these things you've already brought up already. So essentially, you want to try and eliminate all plastic that you can. So remember how I said you want to eliminate 3, 6, and 7 because those are not PPA free. If you do want to reuse plastics, I would advise against it, but if you do want to reuse plastics, it's 2, 4, and 5 that you can reuse. If you want to store food in containers, I would suggest using anything other than plastic. So things such as Pyrex or glass, or perhaps stainless steel. If you must use Tupperware or plastics, please wash them by hand rather than chucking them in the dishwasher. And that's because dishwashers might use hotter temperatures. And remember, hot temperatures means more leaching of the additives into the plastic, out of the plastic and into the environment. Also, they use jets of water. So, those forceful jets can also result in more plastic. If you're warming up food in your microwave, please do not use plastic. Use things like Pyrex or ceramics to do so. This one might be perhaps a bit controversial, but according to the Ministry of Public Health, tap water is safe for us to drink. And the Ministry of Public Health actually has very strict regulations in terms of the quality of tap water. And they also regularly test tap water to ensure that it is potable. Carry a reusable water, preferably not of plastic, water bottle not made of plastic, and also reuse shopping bags. What I do personally is I keep my shopping bags in my car. So if I have to stop at the grocery store or supermarket on the way home, they're there, and so it's convenient for me to use. Cook more at home. I think this is something all of us can do. Not only is eating out associated with higher exposure to plastics because food is put in takeout containers or food wrappers, all of which can have plastics, but also when we cook at home, we control what goes into our food so we can opt for healthier options. So it's a much healthier lifestyle. When you do cook, I would advise that you use pans made of stainless steel or cast iron rather than nonstick, because nonstick contains, the reason why nonstick is because it contains these plastic additives. Recycle when you can. Recycling is not the not a great option, but it's still better than the alternatives, landfill, incineration, or litter. Obviously, you don't want to litter because essentially littering winds up in the oceans, which then winds up on our plates eventually down the road. When it comes to clothes, be mindful of which clothes you do opt for. If you can if you can do so, then prefer items that are made of natural fibers rather than synthetic. And whatever items you do own, take good care of them, because if you maintain them for longer, it means that you are not exposing yourself to more plastic consumption. And so you're minimizing the health impacts on your health, as well as perhaps going a little bit easier on your wallet. So with that, I just have a few of my references here on screen. I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So, Dr. Abraham, thank you very much for that very enlightening presentation. You've given us a wonderful overview about the usage of plastics, about the effects on our health and so on. So now one of the questions that we've received is that, keeping in view what you've told us, Mr. Ahmed is asking why plastic is still being used to order packed foods. So food packaging is, if it's likely not to be, recycled, then why are we still using it? Any thoughts?
So that is a very complex question. It's an excellent question. Thank you for that. Yeah, the simple answer is convenience, right? So if we have takeaway containers that are easy for us to use and just dispose of, it's something that's built into the system, and so it's become the norm. And so because of that, I think, a lot of us just mindlessly use this. And so what we have to do is try and be more mindful of the fact and try and make a change within our own lives to try and avoid doing so. So if you do go out, rather than ordering in, I would suggest you go to the restaurant, sit in the restaurant, spend some time with your family members, have a conversation, and you're actually you're not using plastic there. And if possible, if you can have your own kinds of takeout containers when you're going, for example, to a cafeteria, when you're having lunch at your workplace, bring food from home, I would suggest, if possible. And obviously, then you're going to have containers that hopefully are not made of plastic. So wherever you can, if possible, you can try and cut out plastic, especially, like I said, in terms of grocery bags. A lot of our attendees mentioned that in terms of carrying around a reusable water bottle, things in your personal life where you can, and if it's possible for you to make these changes, I think you should do so.
Great, thank you, Dr. Abraham. So yeah, definitely, and I think now I'm definitely noticing in the supermarkets now where you have plastic containers available, which you can use for like packaging or just take away foods. You also have these cardboard containers now available, which are recyclable. You can reuse them, and which are biodegradable actually. So you are seeing now these in the market. Again, they might be a little bit more expensive now, compared to the foil containers or the plastic containers. But I think we are definitely seeing more of these products available in the market. The other thing I've also seen is like with delivery. If you're asking for delivery, even if the containers are being used are plastic, but then you can opt to tell them, okay, if you don't need, the plastic cutlery, if you are going to eat at home, you don't need to be collecting or using all the plastic cutlery. So, okay, so I think a lot of people, again, the whole idea is to just, engage people in recycling wherever they can, not to use plastics and all of that. So another questions is from Mr. Ahmad Mama, and he's saying, why can't we start using biodegradable plastic? Because plastic is a big part of our lives.
Another excellent question. So biodegradable plastic it's a oversimplification, I would say. So there are a lot of challenges when it comes to this. So number one, I would say, is that they are obviously more expensive to use than the regular plastic. And so it's not affordable for a lot of people to use biodegradable plastics. The other thing to consider is that biodegradable plastics, what that means is that they break down a lot quicker than the average or the conventional plastic does. But what does it break down into? A lot of the time, it breaks down into microplastics. So it's shifting the problem from one place to another without really dealing with the problem, if you know what I'm trying to say. So ideally, it's a solution that we should use along with many different solutions. It should be like one amongst many different solutions, a whole suite of solutions that we can use to try and minimize the impacts of plastic production.
Great, thank you very much. So, Dr. Abraham, any thoughts on what we can do to, to move away from the use and the throw culture of convenience and waste? What are your thoughts about that?
So there are two things that I think there are two approaches to this. One is sort of a bottom-up approach, which is we as individuals should be trying to make an effort and start like a grassroots movement. And we are seeing that over here. There are communities, there are sort of like grassroots movements happening here where people are trying to reduce their plastic consumption. So I know, for example, there are a number of Instagram accounts where, for example, if you don't want to buy, you can sort of bring your own containers for things such as dishwashing soap, and they'll just fill up those containers for you. In a lot of these grocery stores, supermarkets here, they do allow you to bring in your own containers, and you can buy things like grains or pulses and things like that. So that those ideas are starting to grow over here. But then there's also a top-down approach, which is basically trying to see policies and interventions being put into place. And we are seeing that over here as well. So what it is that we as individuals can do, I think, is talk to our family members and try and incorporate these into our own livelihoods as well.
Great, thank you, Dr. Abraham, for that. So, Dr. Abraham, of course, everybody is very interested in fashion and wants to be really up to date on wearing clothes and fashion. Any comments on the use of plastics in the clothing and fast fashion? Many people, they may not be aware of how much synthetics and plastics are being used in fast fashion nowadays.
Thank you very much for that question. It is a very good question. As I said, a lot of synthetics, in fact, all synthetics are considered to be plastics. And so they are a part of the problem. And fast fashion specifically, for those of you who don't know, fast fashion is the idea that, we have this culture of buying something because it looks good, it attracts our attention. So I buy it, even though I already have perfectly usable, good quality material in my own wardrobe. I have this, because it catches my eye, I just buy it, and I wind up buying a whole bunch of clothes that I don't necessarily need. And then I might use it only for a short period of time before discarding it or giving it away for recycling or whatever it may be. And the problem with this idea is that a lot of these companies, the quality of the textile that we wind up having is actually not great quality. And so this results in it not having a very long lifespan. And so the idea then is you wind up buying more and throwing away more. So this winds up producing a lot of waste. And so ideally, what we would like to do is, if possible, you want to invest in good quality material, preferably things that are made of natural fibers. And when you do have whatever it is that you have in your wardrobe, maintain them well, take care of them well so they last a longer time. And so this results in less waste being produced. And it also means, you're not spending as much money on, you're going easier on your wallet as well.
Great, thank you. So Dr. Abraham, I know you'd referred to, that there's some evidence as to, the use of plastic and it resulting in, some diseases. Uh, is, is there any evidence available on the excessive use of plastic and autism or any other similar diseases? Have you read any or are you aware of any?
So we do not have any conclusive evidence that says that the exposure to plastic is linked to autism.
Mhm.
There is very, very, very preliminary data that suggests that there is a link between plastic consumption and, for example, cognitive development disorders, but that those disorders are not linked to autism. So I would say currently we don't have any information on this. It's far too early for us to be able to say anything conclusive on that fact or question.
Right. Great. I think we are done with the questions. I think we've had a wonderful session. So just before we conclude, Dr. Abraham, can you give us like 3 key points, what you would suggest for us as takeaway points, from this session? And how can we really, help the environment, help the climate, and a lot of other things, and try and preserve this for our future generations?
Okay, so I would say, first of all, just be mindful of the fact that plastics are, they're taken for granted in our society, and I think we should not be doing so. And so basically, we need to be more aware of where plastics are and what they are doing to not just our own health, but also the health of the environment. And again, whatever it is that you feel you're capable of doing in terms of minimizing the plastic consumption or the amount of plastic that you're using, I think you should opt to do so. In terms of what we can do, how do we stay up to date? There's an excellent website that I would suggest you can follow. It's something called Environment Health News. I can put that on the chat. It's a non-profit, so there is no. It's basically they're dedicated to translating the science for the layperson to understand. And it's an excellent source in terms of staying up to date in the topic. So I can put that in the chat. If you just Google this topic, this environmental health news, it's an excellent source. But thank you very much for the questions and for your attention. And thank you to everyone on the team as well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you to all our participants for joining us.